So we are continuing our conversation on the 7 domains of grieving, this complex and often overwhelming process that most of us will experience someday. Grief is the powerful feeling of sadness that may come when we lose someone or something, but grieving is the process of working through that loss. Now, in the emotional domain, which we're exploring today, the emotions can be sadness, anger, frustration, love, guilt, and despair. And in the Scope virtual studio today is Jacqueline Schifrar, who's going to help us think about the emotional aspect of this process. Jackie's a nurse practitioner in women's health who's had a practice taking care of women for 43 years. And she has her own experience with grief and grieving that she'll share, and we will try to understand what can happen. And Jackie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kurtleigh, for inviting me.
We're going to be talking about how suicide affects a family. If this is a difficult process for you, please listen another time or skip this part or go on to our other domains. So, Jackie, this is a hard way to start the conversation, but can you help us understand how you came to think about grief and grieving, how you came to this experience?
Yeah, the loss of my awesome son, Nicholas, who is 29, who is a PhD student at Penn State, Pennsylvania, recognized that he was suicidal, and he really sought out help. Initially saw his counselor, and they quickly admitted him to a psychiatric hospital in Pennsylvania. And after, I believe it was 2 to 3 days after being in the hospital, he hung himself in his hospital room. He then was transported to Allegheny Hospital in Pennsylvania, where we had to take him off life support. So this was very devastating for me and my family and my husband and his brother. So that's where we started.
So that's a big and a really hard start. You actually had some really hard decisions to make, because although he tried to commit suicide, did commit suicide, but he was brain dead, and you had to make some decisions when you went out to Pennsylvania?
Yeah, because, they did all the MRIs, the testing, and basically if we didn't pull him off life support, he wouldn't be a functional person. So we had to take him off life support, which was very difficult, but in a way, that was what we needed to do.
I mean, I was there with you, and I have to tell who's listening is that I've known Nick since he was a baby. So he's a dear, dear boy to me too. But Jackie, can you talk to us a little bit about what happened in terms of your early grief, and what are some of the physical signs of the grief that you experienced?
Well, initially, I think it was a combination of a lot of anger, and the other thing is guilt. Of course, I felt so guilty. I called Nick every day, every morning, every evening. And the one morning that I didn't call him, I usually called him at 7 because there was a time difference. So I called him at 7 in the morning, and usually like at 4 or 5 in the evening. But the one morning I didn't call him, and that's when they actually ended up calling me and said that they found him, that he had hung himself. So I feel guilty, number one, that I didn't call him. Number two, that when he was initially at the hospital, I didn't go there, but it was really a tough time because it was COVID, and the restrictions were such we couldn't even go in there. Even when he was in the hospital on life support because of COVID, we couldn't even see him. We only were allowed one visitor, which was my husband, Ken. And then when we had to take him off life support, they allowed me to go in there a couple hours before we had to put, and that was the only time I was able to see him. So COVID had really put a big piece of all of this stress on us.
We talked a little bit, Jackie, when you were early in experiencing this, about the physical symptoms that you had. And not only were you feeling so sad and so angry and guilty, but you were sick. Jackie, you were sick.
I couldn't eat. I lost 50 pounds. And I guess if anything out of all this, I guess now I'm skinny.
Yeah, you are skinny. You didn't have 50 pounds to lose, Jackie.
Well, I mean, yeah. So I lost 50 pounds. My appetite still isn't the best. I couldn't sleep and I'm just really sad. But I felt that I was able to still function. Nighttime was always hard because I cried every day. I would think about him every day, every night when I would go to bed, every moment when I would wake up in the morning. So I think that the constant remembrance of Nick really took a toll.
I know you were sad, but can you talk about the difference of being depressed versus being sad? Can you talk about that?
I feel that when you're grieving, yeah, I'm depressed, but I think it's more sadness. Because when I look at depression, as a clinician, we always have an evaluation tool where we check the boxes and then you get a number, a grade of, are you really depressed? Do you need therapy? Do you need medical treatment? Do you need to be in the hospital? And for me, I thought I was grieving because I felt very functional. I went to work. I got up in the morning. I took care of myself physically. I was able to go and be very functional at work. I was able to keep my relationships with my friends. I didn't totally withdraw. So I have had women who have experienced the same loss as I have, who have lost a child. And I could see there is a difference between depression and grieving, because one woman who I've known, that she really was depressed and she actually attempted suicide. I mean, she's fine now. She's doing great. But to me, there's significant depression. And I'm sure that there are some statistics of men, women who have experienced the same thing that I have, that actually have been successful in committing suicide from the loss of a child.
Well, I think of it as grief is the loss of the other, and you're focused on the other, what you've lost. But depression is the loss of yourself, and nothing is worth living for. Nothing is worth it anymore. And so it tends to be it's turned more inward. And as I watched you in your grieving process, it was still turned outward toward Nick. It was toward what you had lost. And it wasn't all about you, Jackie. It was all about Nick.
Yeah. And as I said, I feel that I was able to function. And I think, going to work has probably been one of the best things for me, to keep my mind off of it. And that's one of the things, is to try to keep my mind off thinking about him. But that's still hard.
But you've been, I think you've been very willing to share your experience. So I have learned a lot from you as you've talked about it with me. I mean, as I go through my own grieving processes, and I think part of your work has been willingness to share what's gone on with you so that other people might learn a little bit. Has that been helpful?
Yeah.
Well, that people talk about complicated grief as something that goes on where you've actually turned the grieving inwards and it lasts more than 6 months. And I'll say that I grieved the loss of my dad when he died when I was 20 for 10 years. And it's still, thinking of his death can still knock me off my socks. So do you think that there's a time course that's the right one or the wrong one? People say, am I normal? Is this too much? Am I normal when I'm grieving like this? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and that's one of the things I always talk to my therapist about, because I feel like, why am I still struggling and still crying and still thinking? And everybody's different. That's the best I can say, is it's just time. It's always going to hurt, but it's going to hurt less over time. And I think it's what you do as an individual because of this loss to honor that person who was lost, whether it be, some kind of dedication or just something.
I think of the loss of a child, and you and I, as having taken care of women and infertile women over these many years together, you said something about the loss of a child versus the loss of a parent.
Well, I've lost my parents, and it's kind of the loss of a parent is the loss of the,
It's like the loss of the shared past for me when I lost my daddy.
Yeah, it was the loss of the past. Then you talk about a loss of a spouse, the loss of the present. And when you lose a child, it's the loss of the future. And Nick was such an incredible young man. He was so smart. He had a master's degree in divinity and he's working on his PhD. He was a poet and just such a kind young man and gifted in so many ways. And I just feel that, at some point he was going to have some kind of a great profession, get married, have kids. So, that loss of the future with enjoying at this point in my life, to me, it's your kids and your grandkids and great grandkids. And that to me is lost.
It is a loss. We've talked a little bit about people who miscarry, who are pregnant, particularly if they've been trying to get pregnant for a while and they've lost, maybe it wasn't even a fetus that they lost, the pregnancy that they lost, but they lost in their heart. That was a child. It was a child that they cuddled. It was a toddler that toddled. It was a kid in school. It was their future, a wedding. So you lose all this, the idea of what a future is going to be that we all hope for our children. So the loss of a child, they say, I hope I don't have to experience this, but it's like the worst. It's the worst.
Yes, and I agree. And as I said, I think this is probably the biggest challenge of my life. I mean, illnesses are tough, and I think many people lose children from illnesses, cancers. I guess there's just something about suicide which is, to me, a little more challenging because he made that choice. Cancer, unfortunately, they don't have the choice. But suicide, I think, is a little different in a way. I mean, it's still a loss, but suicide to me is a little tougher.
When we lose children or family members who have a disease, we're often with them at the end, but almost by definition, suicide is a lonely act. It's a lonely act. And the very thought that your child was alone just tears your heart out.
Yeah. And the thing about it is he reached out to us and he recognized that he was struggling and we wanted him to get the help, which he followed through. And so he was doing the right thing. So that's the other tough part of it.
Right. He was on suicide watch and it wasn't enough.
Right. Yep.
In your own case, did you reach out for help as you were trying to figure out how you were going to carry on? And you did. I know you still saw patients and you still reached out to family and friends, and you've been a great friend to me. But did you reach out for help for you?
For me, the outpouring of love and support from friends, and it's just amazing. I have connected with that Nick knew that I even never knew that reached out to me and have developed friendships with them. I mean, one woman lives in England. Another woman lives in Penn State where Nick was living, and she and her husband love Nick dearly. I think the connection was more because Nick was into the Jewish religion. That was one of the big connections, but he would go over their house and they just loved him dearly. So, it's amazing. And then actually there was a professor from the University of Chicago where Nick graduated with his master's degree. He lives in Jerusalem and he has connected with me several times. He actually felt very guilty that Nick lost and he felt like he should have done more for him. So I've connected with a lot of Nick's friends that I've never met before. And also I've connected with a lot of Nick's close friends from high school, and I still keep in touch with them, and that's been helpful. And so, I mean, the friends are a big thing. I did a lot of reading also. I read a lot on books on grieving and suicide. There was one book in particular that kind of hit me, was the book Unthinkable by Jamie Raskin. Jamie is a congressman in, I think it's Maryland. And Jamie lost his son probably a couple months after Nick passed. He committed suicide. And so he wrote this book. He kind of felt guilty that he didn't recognize because his son died at home in their house. And so he felt guilty about that he didn't recognize his son, that he was that depressed to take his own life. So reading was also very helpful for me. Lots of reading.
Well, that guilt, which is that sense of anger turned inward toward yourself, you mentioned that you saw a therapist who kind of gave you some ideas about how you might manage the complexity of your grieving and some of your actions that maybe were making it better and maybe were making it worse. Can you talk about that?
After Nick's passing, I just pulled out a lot of things, kind of memory things maybe I gave him, lots of pictures and candles. I'm into the lottery, and I used to light one of the Jewish candles. I can't remember the name of the candle, but it's a traditional thing for the Jews. I buy a lottery ticket, and then when the drawing was, I would light the candle and then put my lottery ticket and think I would win the millions of dollars. So I had a lot of things that were constant reminders, and my therapist said to me, you need to just take them away. And then at some point, you can always bring them back. There was one thing that I did keep. It was just a teeny little plaque that Nick bought, but he never sent it to me. And when I unfortunately had to go through all his stuff in his apartment, I found it, and that's the only thing I have left. And it says, Mom, to the world you might be one person, but to one person you might be the world. And so that's the one thing that I've kept, and I have it by my bedside.
Well, it's been 3 years now?
Yeah.
And we just had a celebration of life. And do you feel that that was helpful, or did it just stir things all up over again? How are you doing since then?
I think it brought up a lot, and it was really hard. But I think it was a good thing because Nick was cremated. And there's really, I know how people go on Memorial Day and, go see the grave, and there was never really graves. So the good thing is we got a memory tree. It's an elm tree that's at Red Butte Gardens. And that's kind of one of the things that will be helpful, so I can go and, just sit and think of Nick. And the other thing is he was an incredible poet. He must have had hundreds of poems. And so, for the celebration of life, for everyone who attended, put together a poem book of all the poems that Nick did, but also there were several poems that were written, number one, by my sister, and also one of Nick's good friend, Phoenix. And also, Curtly, what you wrote for Nick, which was amazing, and that also is in the poetry book. So that was very helpful for me, but it was very hard. It took me 3 years to do it. Not that I did it every day, but it was pulling out all those poems and reading them. I thought, you are amazing. All those poems were just amazing. And how did you do all this? It was just, there were so many of them.
So how are you moving forward now? I mean, what keeps you going now? Where do you see bright spots?
Work is still very good for me. I work with a great group of physicians, practitioners, medical assistants, ancillary staff. And I think that being at work, I don't think of Nick that much. On occasion, sometimes it may come out with patients of what's going on with their life, or patients who I've talked about. They'll ask me, how is Nick? Because I would always brag about my kids to my patients. So I think work has been very helpful. Friends also still helpful. Not that we talk about it, but just being social and talking about other things outside of Nick is helpful. And then just my physical activity, being passionate about biking and cycling. I bike up, last week I biked to the top of Big Mountain up Immigration. And then this past weekend, I went up to the top of Mill Creek. And then my next plan is to go up to the top of Snowbird. So my biking is passionate, and I'm also passionate about pickleball, which I think those activities keep my mind off things.
It's been a gift, a hard gift to have you share, be able to be part of watching you grow and become this incredibly much stronger person through your own efforts. You're a monster bicyclist and a pretty wicked pickleball player, but you're an artist, and your artwork and your jewelry has become more informed by your experience. So in many ways, it's been a gift to be able to hear what you've been doing. And we have just touched on the emotional experience of grief and the process of grieving today. If this has called up powerful emotions for you or your own thoughts of suicide, please reach out for help. The National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is reached by dialing 988. And Jackie, thanks for helping us today to think about this. And we do this to help remember Nick and all the other children we've lost.